Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's August 23rd, 2021, and today we're talking about some ideas outlined recently on T-Circle Myanmar and in a longer journal article by Stephen Campbell, Assistant Professor in the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Luke. Thanks for having us.
And by Elliott Prasse-Freeman, Assistant Professor in Sociology and Anthropology at the National University of Singapore. Hello, Elliott.
Hello, good to be here.
Ethnicity and economics are vexing and complex issues in Myanmar. Stephen and Elliott, however, have come up with some really interesting ideas in a co-authored paper they recently published in the Journal of Contemporary Asia. It's called Revisiting the Wages of Burman-ness, Contradictions of Privilege in Myanmar. So, you could both be characterised as middle-class white guys, just like me, and you, along with some scholars before you, think that conversations about white privilege can also be useful for understanding the position of the Bama, or the Burman, in contemporary Myanmar, though you take a new approach to it by invoking an older theorisation of that privilege. Before we get into that, let's begin with what these ideas of whiteness or Burman or Bama identity are. You know, in Myanmar we have this official government list of ethnic groups. We have armies fighting for ethnic identity and autonomy, nationalist education schemes, multiple languages, changing cultures. So what do we first need to understand about ethnicity in order to understand how privilege works in Myanmar?
So thanks, Luke, for asking that. I think by identifying us as essentially, white Western scholars, that motivates our jumping off point. Obviously that's our sort of positionality, and we comment on Myanmar ethnicity with that sort of humility that comes with not being obviously native to these categories, but given a little bit of distance, we're able to see a huge diversity in the expression of those things that you just described. And that emerges from our own respective anthropological fieldwork over the past 10 to 15 to 20 years now, in which we've seen a disjoint between the discourse about ethnicity in Myanmar that comes both from the state, often from people themselves, and then certainly from the academic community. And that's one we characterize as one of reification. That's a sort of fancy word that we think that academics love to use because it sounds fancy, which essentially suggests in many of the accounts that these are really fixed, immutable, eternal descriptions of identity that people are classified into, and they become a sort of destiny. But in our field work, and again, with the caveats that this is often, in my case at least, lowland, Bama-centric field work, I witness a bunch of mutability and flexibility, not simply at the level of, are you X group, are you this lumyo, or are you that lumyo, the word for a kind of person or sometimes race, but even at the level of category itself. And I'll give you an example of what we mean by that. So according to a sort of Western epistemological, and this is obviously very much historical, based in historical kind of ideas of people and their kinds, race is a pretty fixed idea, even though we're trying to destabilize it in the academy over the last, however many years. People have an idea of what a race or ethnicity is. In Myanmar, on the other hand, you can get people saying that I am Muslim Lumyo, or Hindu Lumyo, or even Bota Bata Lumyo, which would be Buddhist Lumyo. And what this suggests that those fixed categories are not as fixed in Myanmar, even at the level of the category itself. And so while we have this fascinating relationship between, on one hand, the 135 Dainyinta, right? And people will insist sometimes that these are blood-based categories that you cannot escape. But then on the other hand, at the same time, people can maintain that one can kind of switch their lumyo, or the same person who will say, I'm Bama lumyo sit sit, then you'll ask them, well, what about your father or your grandfather? And they'll say, oh, well, actually, yeah, now that I come to think of it, they were Kiyin, or they were something else. And then people that we've interacted with during our field work will say, I pass as Bama or I'm functionally Bama, even though my parents are this or that. So we took this as a point of departure for trying to explore what else was going on here, and to try to start by saying it's not as simple as the way that it's been told to us, because a lot of the academic discourse says this is ethnicities are fixed and reified because of the colonial encounter, full stop, and that just wasn't our experience. And so we wanted to open up another conversation about these things that seem fixed.
So I can add a little bit about the analytical or theoretical approach that's informing this understanding, because as you mentioned, Luke, about our own positionality, also being both in North America, although I'm from Canada, that there's been, I think, a big influence on us about this push and this increased emphasis on recognizing the Black radical tradition. It's, of course, a global tradition, but a lot of the discussions around it have been quite prominent in the US especially. And so a lot of the debates that have come out that have been really important for us have been those that have been pushing for a recognition of the materiality or the political economic underpinnings of racial inequality in the US, but also in Canada, where I'm from, and elsewhere, such that it pushes back against a certain white liberalism that would try to reduce racial inequalities and racism to the level of discourse, belief, or attitude. So a lot of Black radicals in the US and elsewhere have been arguing that actually we need to pay attention to the political economic underpinnings of racism. So this would include the ways in which the political economic inequality through segmented labor markets, for example, becomes justified or legitimated through racism or through racial inequalities. And this, in fact, serves as a process of racialization where people get reified into these categories or pushed into these reified categories. So the argument is that in order to address racial and ethnic inequality, we can't avoid dealing with these deeper political economic questions, which demand material reparations and an engagement with questions of dispossession and at that level of materiality. So that's informing us from our own background in North America, but we saw certain resonances with the Myanmar leftist tradition, and in particular exemplified by authors like Bama, who also wrote about the political economic underpinnings of ethnic inequality in Myanmar. So, for example, in his novel Yoma Taipwe from 1963, he talks about the political economic difference or inequality between the uplands and the lowlands, and how this led to certain forms of ethnic conflict, not out of any inherent sense of antagonism or superiority as the root cause, but rather the ways in which the uplands and the lowlands had been historically constituted as distinct, and heavily, of course, through the colonial process and the differences between the direct rule in the lowlands and the indirect rule in much of the highlands. And this led to this sense of the political economic separation of these areas, which then fueled a feeling of ethnic difference. And so ethnic identity, ethnicization, or racialization was heavily informed by this political economic divergence or inequality. And so at the same time, Bama recognized, and in this book from 1963, he was writing about the anti-fascist struggle in World War II. He argued that solidarity was necessary in the anti-fascist struggle against the Japanese occupation. However, this solidarity across ethnic lines couldn't be taken for granted, meaning that there couldn't be this assumption that, of course, everyone is from Myanmar, so we have this shared sense of identity, and that's sufficient to form a basis of solidarity. Instead, Bama argued that solidarity cannot be taken for granted. Solidarity is difficult, especially across enduring relations of inequality, informed by the political economic unevenness in Myanmar. So on the one hand, solidarity is necessary. On the other hand, solidarity is difficult. And so it demands a sort of dialogic or process of dialoguing across these these enduring levels of political economic inequalities, enduring relations of inequality. And so Elliott and I saw a certain theoretical or analytical resonance between, on the one hand, the Black radical tradition, as exemplified in particular by W.E.B. Du Bois and his book, Black Reconstruction in America from 1935. And on the other hand, the Myanmar leftist tradition, as exemplified by Bama Chinong, and in particular his 1963 novel, Yoma Taipwe. And so that theoretical or analytical background informed our approach to these questions around ethnicity, inequality, and the current movement to build on a broader solidarity across ethnic and religious lines in the struggle against military rule following the February coup.
Great. And let's get back to the current context and the need for solidarity in a little while. There is one sentence that really leapt out at me in the paper. You write that Bama, or Burman, used to be an ethnically fluid, class-inflected and anti-colonialist identity. Now, anyone who's spent some time in Myanmar and reading a bit about Burmese politics or Burmese research will probably find that sentence really fascinating, like me. So when and how was that, and what has Bama become today?
One of the first parts of our intervention starts by re-examining the work of Kei Nomoto, who looks at the Do Bama Asiyon.
Hi everyone, I'm just making a quick edited insertion here. So the Do Bama Asiyon, which means We Burmans Association, was a nationalist group formed in the 1930s that was really important to the nationalist movement and eventual independence of Burma from British colonialism. Now, back to Elliott. He's referring to the scholar Kei Nomoto and his research on the association. Most directly, relevantly, the piece published in the year 2000 in the Journal of Burma Studies.
He identifies sort of themes of what he calls Tudo Bama, those Burmese over there, and Do Bama, we Burmese. And this has been taken up by scholars as an example of a sort of racial divide between Bama, or now seen as like Burmans, and all the other Danyan Tha and Indians and Chinese as Tudo Bama, those Burmese that we should oppose. But if you read Nomoto carefully, and if you go back and look at Kin Yee's study of the Do Bama, for instance, it's much more complex. And in fact, the Tudo Bama, Do Bama distinction was one based on what we think is essentially a class divide. The Tudo Bama were those particularly Indians and Chinese, what we might call comprador elites, those ones who identify more with the colonialists and do their bidding in an attempt to succor favor. And of course, these were also what they would call the kapya, the sort of, this is an ungainly term, but sort of mixed race or mixed blood. So that distinction that was drawn, and it presumed to be Bama versus everyone else, particularly the Danyan Tha, so the ethnic nationalities, the Kachin, the Chin, the Mon, the Rakhine, etc., was actually a distinction that seemed to be more drawn against the sort of comprador elites of maybe those groups of the Bama group, but particularly of the Indians and the Chinese. And here we draw a lot on Pyo Wen Lat's dissertation, in which he looked particularly at these discourses. And one of the things that he found that was fascinating is the fluidity, even within the not just the Do Bama, but the more what we might call right-wing discourses that emerged at the same time, still provided an awful lot of flexibility on how one could identify. So this sort of Gapya discourse of mixed blood was not a sort of racial biological tainting in which once you got the wrong kind of blood, your destiny was sealed. Rather, in a lot of these books, like Gapya Pyatana, so the problems of Gapya, the author would say, being Gapya in mind is much worse than being Gapya in blood. And I think Chie Kea also cites this in her book on women, reimagining women in Burma. So I want to also make sure people check that out if they haven't seen it. And as a result, you can see that this is less biological and racial and more what we would call class inflected. One of the things that Gopyo has focused on in that dissertation is how even like dobama can be thought of as more of an adjective than a way of behaving rather than a noun, right? What you actually are. So he identified dobama Muslim, so the ones who were, dobama in spirit, and as a result, a dobama Muslim. Of course, that could make sense, but it doesn't seem like that's something that's very available as a discourse today, where to be Muslim in Myanmar is to not even be Bama. You're not even permitted to be it. Of course, we know that's not true, but that's one of the discourses that circulates. So we were saying, well, what happened? What changed this over time? And I think a lot of the historical work is still yet to be done. And so we provide this article more as a provocation to say, wait, can't just say it's the colonial encounter, because look what was happening in the midst of the colonial encounter. It wasn't what the scholars are saying. It was something quite different. And so as a result, we need to figure out what else was going on. And what's important about the Dobama, or the study of it, is that it didn't really seem all that focused on what we might call the main problem of post-colonial Myanmar, which is the sort of Dainyinta issue of like how to integrate it in a multi-ethnic society. It was much more a problem of colonialism, which makes sense, and one of those who were siding with the colonists or those who were siding with the people who are from here.
Okay, so as Elliott mentioned, there was this fluidity, this ethnic racial fluidity in the colonial period that was quite class inflected, and there was a very capaciousness to the concept of Bama. In the post-colonial period, there was an understandable rejection of colonial political economy and a desire across the board to move away from that. But the way that played out, first of all, there were different conceptions of what that would entail. And there were a lot of debates about this between, of course, the Burma Communist Party and the Socialist Party and UNU and such, and to what extent they were able to align with or separate from these former imperial powers. But within the country, the push against colonial political economy and the desire to reject colonial political economy also played out in a sense of Burmanization and industrialization, where it was seen that in order to become a modern country, industrialization was key on the one hand. And this was, of course, an understanding of development that was quite widespread around the world in the mid-20th century, this development discourse, and especially in decolonizing countries. But there was also this, again, understandable sense that to reject colonialism, there was this push, this Burmanization process that also had to take place. And the issue that we argue that the way that this played out is that these were quite intertwined, so that the process of industrialization, the process of capitalist development in Myanmar was inseparable from this discourse of decolonial Burmanization. So, for example, when Ne Win took power in 1962, the nationalization, which was put forth under the label of socialism, was very much racialized, such that the groups that were primarily dispossessed or who had their businesses or property nationalized were largely Indian and Chinese. So on the one hand, this was understood or argued as a response to the colonial political economy, where Indian and Chinese capitalists were able to succeed under the colonial order. And in this sense, it was a decolonial move. But the way it played out was such that industrialization and nationalization became very inflected by these ethnic categories that were developing. So the ethnic category developed in a co-constitutive relationship with political economic development and changes. And so that's one way in which these categories, the category of Burman in particular, became more reified in its relationship to political economic development in the so-called socialist era, or what we would identify as a state capitalist period under Ne Win and the Burma Socialist Program Party.
I could just add there that the development discourse became laminated on top of sort of Burman-ness. So this was because of the large-scale civil wars and insurgencies that were occurring at the same time, that whatever sort of development was pursued became mostly a lowland affair. At the same time, the sort of conventional discourse was that the Dai Nyen Tha were holding the country back from development, either directly by trying to steal the resources of the nation and secede with them, as if the whole all of Myanmar that was carved up during the colonial encounter belonged to the Bama, belonged to the nation, or in a more subtle discourse, indirectly. So the Dai Nyen Tha, they want independence. This causes civil war, which leads to the Sit-Dat, which is the preferred term we use. We don't want to give the Tatmadaw, the sort of respect of the royal name. The Sit-Dat ends up taking power in the country and then leads this hugely destructive civil war where they gain a lot of power as a result. Either way, you have a sort of bifurcation here where the lowlands are trying to develop, and this is seen in terms of the icons of development that the Sit-Dat regimes really loved, so like big roads and dams and bridges and stuff. And then the uplands, all this was kind of backwards. And there was a sort of connection there between development and capitalism and racialization of different groups.
And I'll add that this also allows us to push back against the military's claim that it is unifying or holding together the country against a sort of ethnic fissures or ethnic fractions, because what we're arguing is that it is the military's own aggression, as well as the way that the military is overseeing crony capitalism in the present, which is in fact creating the political economic conditions for conflict and ethnic division that it then claims to be resolving or addressing. So this is also, I think, feeds in this line of analysis, supports very well the CDM's movement today against the military, to say that no, it's not the military that's holding the country together. The military and the military's overseeing of crony capitalism in the present is in fact creating the political economic conditions for ethnic division. And so in order to address these long-standing or these developing ethnic divisions or racial divisions, an engagement with the military's political economic order is necessary, just as an engagement with the political economic underpinnings of racial division and racial inequality in North America, where we're from, is also necessary.
One thing that came to mind that perhaps we didn't actually do a great job in the article of clarifying, but and that's why articles are not always the final word on things, is that we, on one hand, we say that in the past the Bama discourse was much more open and capacious for people to enter into. The Dobama Siyon was constituted by people who were not Burman. And then we say that that's changed, but I want to make a distinction, or we want to make a distinction, that it's changed to the level of discourse or politics, right? The Bama sit, to be a real true Bama and only a Bama is something that's become stronger at the level of discourse, but we still see it as really class inflected on the ground. People enter into and enter out of being Bama all the time. And that's something that's really important and something we want to stress. And that sort of interesting disjuncture between discourse and actual practice is something we want to highlight, and also something that is important to note at the level of the politics, because in some ways Bama is more white than whiteness. If whiteness is a category that is about class wages, but becoming Bama becomes a way of accessing those wages. And this is a subtle form of Burmanization, the theory that we don't really believe has been identified in the literature. Usually Burmanization, to the extent that we understand it, is seen as sort of a direct attempt at hegemony, right? So demanding that people change their religion, demanding that people only speak Burmese in schools. And while some of that has happened, that also creates a sort of object of rejection. There's this wonderful essay by Sai Kun Sai, which is in an edited volume called Citizenship in Myanmar, published by ICES a number of years ago, where he talks about becoming Shan and how he grew up Bama, and he probably would have gone on to just continue be Bama until he was told he couldn't learn Shan. And at that point, he became a committed Shan nationalist. And this sort of obtuse governmentality that we see on the part of the Myanmar state, rather than a subtle, cunning, clever one that works behind their backs, makes ethnicity a sort of relevant category that people can identify with. But there's still that other aspect, the political economic aspect, that weaves in behind people, making it a huge incentive to become Bama in public, if not in private. And one question there is whether over generations, people who are Bama in public and some other Danyenta in private, do their kids end up becoming Bama in both places? And that's a more insidious aspect of Burmanization that can't exist without this political economic aspect to the argument.
One example of where we could see that in the present is with the concentration of factories around Yangon. And although the lowlands are often deemed people writing about Myanmar from outside the country deem the lowlands to be kind of a Burman space, but the factories around Yangon have a large internal migrant population from Irrawaddy Delta, Bago, and other parts of particularly southern Myanmar. But in the factories, there are, of course, many Karen and other non-Burman groups. A good friend of mine, a factor was Naga from Sagai. But in that space, it's coming to Yangon, which is often seen as or deemed kind of lowland Burman space, but is in fact quite ethnically diverse in terms of the backgrounds where factory workers are coming. But that is the kind of political economic conditions which bring people together, require them to speak Burmese. And so that would be one instance of where we can point to the kind of political economic underpinnings of processes of social, cultural ethnicization.
Thank you. That is all very clearly put, and the example of Hlainthea at the end there is definitely appropriate. But let's back up a little bit to the notion of privilege. Others have noted affinities between white privilege and Bama privilege. So how does your take differ from those?
So one of our points of departure was Matt Walton's 2013 article, The Wages of Burman-ness, where he brought in the analytic of white privilege, especially as developed in the US, in order to understand ethnic inequality in Myanmar. And so our engagement with his article is one of the starting points for this article. And Matt Walton's article has been very stimulating, and it has provoked a lot of useful and productive scholarly work. So I think it's a good, solid contribution. But one of our concerns was that in that article, Matt Walton draws on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, and in particularly Du Bois's work in his book, Black Reconstruction in America, as it is sort of reframed and represented in David Roediger's 1991 book, The Wages of Whiteness. So on that level, we're in fact, there's a lot of resonances between our two pieces, but we were concerned because there's quite a big difference in the way that Du Bois characterized white privilege and racial privilege, and the way that a lot of more recent, particularly white liberal characterizations have presented this. So Du Bois argued that white privilege was ambiguous and ultimately harmful to poor whites. So he was looking at the situation just after the Civil War and emancipation, and asked why poor whites would support a racist reimposition of white supremacy when in fact that white supremacist order was in fact maintaining the subordination of the poor working class whites. So for Du Bois, this was a perplexing question. And when he looked into the literature, his argument, what came out of this was that the poor whites were offered a relative material privilege over freed slaves, but also what Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, or we might call the kind of the ideological elements that led white workers and poor whites to feel a sense of attachment into this racial order, which ultimately maintained them in a position of subordination. So on the one hand, there was and there remains a materiality to white privilege. It is not merely ideological. There is in fact a relative material privilege to whiteness in the US. But at the same time, there's also this ideological element, which is interconnected with the material. And the argument ultimately is that it is in the interest of the poor and working class white to align with the freed slaves in post-bellum US in order to resist collectively the imposition of this racial capitalist order that is being pushed by the united capitalist oligarchy in the southern US. So in Du Bois's analysis, racial privilege is contradictory. And this is an incredible analytical contribution that Du Bois made. And so for us, this was a very important part of the analysis that we wanted to bring in. But in Matt Walden's article, despite to his credit, recognizing the importance of W.E. Du Bois's argument, he doesn't bring in this contradictory element, or rather he turns away from the class contradictions of racial privilege when he tries to analyze the situation in Myanmar. And for us, that was a significant shortcoming of that argument. And that's one that we wanted to put forth and to bring in to show how this push for Burman supremacy, the Islamophobia and the anti-Muslim riots that have played out over the past decade, which have been presented by Mabasa as what we might say a Burman first politics, is in fact ultimately harmful to the majority of poor, working class, and peasant in Myanmar who are identified as or who identify as Burman. It's not, in fact, in their material interest. And so there's a political economic argument to be made for the importance of the poor, working class, and peasant Burman to recognize a shared interest with non-Burmans against the imposition of a racialized or ethnicized order under a kind of a Mabasa ideology.
And if I could add just 2 quick points to that. So there's a sort of contradiction here. The poor white or the poor Bama gets a wage, so they seem to be benefiting. How can this be also a poison, something that holds them back? So the idea is they get a wage, but it's paltry, ultimately materially resonant, but not something that would truly lead to their liberation. And as a result, it's sort of like the scraps from the table of their essentially class elites who are saying we're all in this together. And as a result, what W. Du Bois is saying and what we're suggesting as well might be applicable in Myanmar is that the poor Bama has a lot more in common with the poor Danyintha, with the poor Indian or Rohingya than they do with their own class elites. And as a result, they would benefit materially a lot more by forging a class politics or a class-inflected politics that addresses that persistent political economic subordination. The second point is that, to Walton's credit, he spends a lot of time pointing out that this is very much the sort of ethnic problem is a Bama problem, and it needs to be addressed by Bama themselves. And he has a great point in his article where he says Aung San Suu Kyi creates these false equivalences where she says everyone needs to sacrifice, not realizing that her sacrifice, although it's very idiosyncratic and unique, is simply not the same as someone who's had their village burned or has been, terrorized by the Sitdat. Those just aren't, and at the level of the aggregate, a rich Bama person, a crony, enjoying the spoils of the nation is very different than a poor Danyintha person. And so she makes these false equivalences, and he calls those out, which is great. But the problem is kind of the solution. It ends up becoming reduced to this sort of internalized psychological individualist model where you analyze your own privilege and quote unquote check it. And that's really important. That's like an important part of the equation, but it's simply not all there is, because if you insist on everyone checking their privilege, some people are going to react reactionarily, and that's, we think, Mabata in a certain sense, and Mabata-related discourses can be seen in that way. That so there's a famous, now infamous, and we have this in the T-Circle article, cartoon by Maman Fountain, who's the most famous Burmese cartoonist, and he has like a line of ethnicities lining up and presumably to get their privilege, and someone labeled boat person, which is supposed to be the Rohingya, jumps the queue. But what's fascinating about that cartoon is that there's a queue in the first place that he seems to be insisting upon, and the Bama are at the head of that queue. And so what we are suggesting through this cartoon and other discourses that are circulating is that Bama feel threatened by their position. And so calling that out is really important, but it also could lead to reactionary responses such as Mabata if you don't motivate it by a deeper set of political economic changes that would eventually benefit the people who now, much like poor whites in America, feel basically that they're the enemy. And so what we're trying to do here is by bringing in the political economic aspect to provide a political intervention that's possible, as opposed to what we fear from the liberal privilege theory will turn into a bunch of essentially, I mean this in a respectful way, a reductivist identity politics in which people check their privilege, they weep, they clutch their pearls, they apologize, and then they proceed as if everything is the same. And I'm taking this much from the United States, where Ta-Nehisi Coates' really, in my opinion, terrible book has been lauded by white liberals for the very reason that it doesn't demand any change. They can read it at their book clubs on the Upper West Side and say, isn't that great that we saw that, that America is tainted by original racism. Let's proceed by exploiting the working classes, who are mostly brown and black people in America. So that's the concern that we're trying to write against. And we believe that the same kind of analytic can be helpful in Myanmar as well.
Stephen, you heard to Myanmar's leftist tradition already, and we also know that Myanmar was ostensibly a socialist state in the past. So how have people pushed the class solidarity angle going back? Is it incorrect to say these ideas are still yet to gain traction in Myanmar?
Well, I think at one level, it's a bit incorrect to say it hasn't gained traction, because Bama Tong was an extremely influential and popular public intellectual in his day. His books were widely read, and significantly, he has an ethnic Chin background, but he was widely read and extremely respected by Burmese reading public. That was he was writing primarily from the late 40s into the late 60s. He passed away in the late 70s. So he did have a big influence, but I think that there is a legitimate concern, but also I would say a bit ultimately erroneous, that some people look back and they say, well, there was this socialist period from 1962 to 1988, and it was terribly authoritarian and abusive. Therefore, and some Burmese friends who I respect very much will say like, oh, now we don't want socialism or leftism, we want democracy, as though these two things are opposite, because they are identifying a very legitimate critique of Ne Win and the Burma Socialist Program Party rule from 1962 to 88. But interestingly, even people within the Burma Socialist Program Party did not believe that it was in fact socialist. So U Chit Lai, who was one of the ideological architects of the Burma Socialist Program Party, acknowledged in his memoirs that in fact the BSPP rule was not socialist, it was state capitalist. So the kinds of exploitation that we see in a capitalist order of labor or through unequal trade relations with peasants persisted under the so-called socialist rule, but they were ultimately capitalist forms of exploitation, which there was an attempt to legitimize with the language of socialism. And so some younger people today, or people who grew up maybe after 88 and have looked back, have understandably and appropriately rejected the approach to politics of the BSPP and Ne Win. But because Ne Win tried to legitimate those politics with the language of socialism, there has been an unfortunate side effect that some people have taken Ne Win at his word and taken the BSPP at his word and said, okay, that actually was socialist, or that actually was leftist politics. But in fact, it's it's not the case. And I think that there are currently a lot of really brilliant, younger than me, activists who are recalling or re-engaging a lot of these debates and arguments that happened in the Myanmar leftist tradition. Not necessarily taking them unquestionably or without question, but engaging them critically and thinking what can be learned, what can be gained from re-engaging the Myanmar leftist tradition, including people like Bama Tong, but also like Dagong Thaya, or another author who I've written about, Jamie, has also had some brilliant leftist writing. There's a huge, or Lududa Ama, there are too many to name here. And so there is at least among activists who I'm friends with, have been in the present re-engaging the Myanmar leftist tradition to see what it can contribute to thinking through an anti-military politics in the present.
Okay, so now coming to today, what challenges does this position of the Bama, this wage, suggest for cross-ethnic solidarity building and collective struggle now in post-coup 2021 Myanmar, this world of the National Unity Government, the State Administration Council, People's Defence Forces, ethnic armed organisations, and myriad unaligned anti-coup resistance groups that mushroom, they kill people, then they disappear. Challenges and maybe solutions, if you've got any.
Sure. We hesitate to say that now is a hopeful time given the tragedy of the coup and so many lives that have been upended. At the same time, the last 10 years have both been a tragedy in a certain sense, but also one that became very difficult to identify as such. There was a sort of tautological element to any rejection of criticism of Aung San Suu Kyi's regime, because people always said, well, just give it some time. And that could have continued for who knows how long. The coup made it clear that the time is up, and the time was probably never going to be right. As a result, people are forced to really radically re-examine the sort of foundations of their politics. You can see this index on the street during the early days of the CDM, when people went quite spontaneously from wearing the red to signify the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi and her release to wearing black. And that one of my favorite signs said, essentially in Burmese, like, we're not green, we're not red, we're something else. And we have to overthrow the coup and then get to something else. The question of what that else is the big question. And so there's a concern that NUG is a reconsolidation of the same class-blind politics of the NLD, and won't end up addressing the material conditions that lead to the continuing schisms between the ethnicities. And that's why the sort of concern about checking the privilege that we hear on the street and people apologizing to groups like the Rohingya and other Danyinta, while good, they might run into a sort of roadblock or run into a dead end if they don't start to address things that are of a more material nature, so that people who are Danyinta, who are non-Bama, can say, okay, this seems a little bit more likely to change the conditions instead of just being a bunch of rhetoric. And so at the end of the T-Circle piece, we talk about some of the things that could happen. So serious project of political economic restructuring would involve land reform, very different than the 2012 land laws that end up taking supposedly vacant fallow and virgin land and giving it to cronies, and then Aung San Suu Kyi saying, I believe that cronies, national entrepreneurs can work for the future of the nation. Instead of that, involving real land reform and giving the means of production back to people, especially in a very agrarian society like Myanmar, will be really important. Nationalizing military holding companies, significant redistribution of wealth, a federalism that puts real resource control into the hands of non-Bama people rather than the NLD running their own candidates in those areas. All those things are kind of material, substantive policy kind of ideas that we could suggest. And ultimately, of course, if they're taken up, and other things that we haven't even thought of are very much up to the people who would forge that politics themselves.
Before we wrap up, it's a tradition to ask our guests for a recommendation, something you've been paying attention to or recently read or watched about Myanmar. Maybe we can start with you, Stephen. What do you have for us?
Well, I'd kind of like to just reiterate something that we've said in this discussion about the importance of engaging the Myanmar leftist tradition. And that's something that a lot of our Myanmar colleagues are doing themselves. And it's a place where I've definitely learned a lot, not just about Myanmar, but also political and analytical and theoretical insights that I think are relevant for a broader audience, even people who are not necessarily trying to understand Myanmar. But so we mentioned, for example, Bamotin Ong's book, Yoma Taipwe. And I've written about that in an article recently in Critical Asian Studies. But any, I think, engagement with that by scholars or others who are studying Myanmar, I think is very important. Another individual, Ludu Da'ama, who I recently translated an article that she wrote for, it's up on T-Circle. I think she also has a lot of really important insights about the political economy of gender inequality in Myanmar. So I think I would really encourage a stronger engagement by everyone in this really rich Myanmar leftist tradition. I know that for me, it's been very productive theoretically, analytically, and politically in my own understanding, not just of Myanmar, but elsewhere as well.
My recommendation actually is along the lines of Stephen's, but rather than being historical leftist or work on the materiality of everyday exchange in Myanmar, something that I read recently, but as a reviewer, so it's not out yet. So your listeners will have to look for it, hopefully in a special issue of the Journal of Burma Studies, although I proofed it for a different outlet, is a set of articles that focus on daily struggles in Myanmar. And they are a fascinating group of essays that are written by students affiliated with, I think, Mandalay University for the most part, as well as others, that focus on, survival in trash dumps in Mandalay, tea shop culture, and the relationship with child labor there, and other really fascinating shots of daily life that then draw out sociological and anthropological conclusions that we might otherwise miss. I don't know what the title will be, but if you do end up seeing it in the Journal of Burma Studies, hopefully that's what I'm talking about here.
Awesome. I look forward to that. Well, thank you so much for giving so much of your time. So thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Elliott.
Thanks for having us, Luke.